I never imagined the hollow of night could shine. For 3 nights a presence entered my room, a blue light that pulsed like breathing skin. Embrace the fear. The being whispered not into my ears, but into the empty corridors of my thoughts. I trembled, pinned between terror and wonder. How could that visitation carry me from the edge of bankruptcy to my hands on the wheel of a car I had only dared to sketch on paper? If reality is a mirror of what we vibrate inside, then something in me was about to change, and a small, impossible proof was waiting in the dark. I am 48. I say it like a fact, but the number tastes like tired metal in my mouth. I run my thumb along the spine of a sketchbook and the paper is rough under my skin. Our office used to smell of cedar and new glue ideas made wood, but lately it smells of dust and overdue notices. The pandemic shaved contracts away like a storm stripping leaves. One after another, clients folded their budgets. I learned to read the bank's tone in a single line of an email. It felt like reading weather before a hurricane. My wife, Diana, moves through the apartment with small, careful noises. She tries to hold me with words. "Miguel, you will turn this around," she says, and her voice is a soft tool trying to mend a frayed cable. Her eyes, though, are a ledger. I see the ledger at breakfast, the worry carved into the muscles around her mouth. We sleep in the same room, but the bed has become 2 islands of worry. The radiator clicks at night like a patient heart. I wake to that click and a thin sweat on my back. The hours expand like gum. I have routines that are prisons. I open the laptop at dawn and scroll numbers until my hands ache. I rehearse apologies in the shower. I avoid phone calls from numbers I don't recognize. I take the little blue pills at dusk and count breaths. The pills hush the noise, but they also mute color. My breath is short. My chest feels like a drawer stuck half closed. The cinder block of anxiety sits in my sternum. My face in the bathroom mirror is lined in a way that wasn't there 10 years ago. There are micro-sacrifices I perform silently. I sell the pens that mean nothing. I skip the roast we liked. I walk past the concession stand where I once saved receipts with trembling pride, and I tell myself I am responsible. That belief is heavy. I thought responsibility was the shape of a man. It begins to feel like a rope around my neck. Sometimes I imagine the office full again. I let my eyes close and I see sunlight over drafting tables, coffee steam, the scratch of pencils. The image feels like a lie I want to believe. The image is thin and fragile, but it is the only pulse besides fear in the night. I say the seed phrase aloud when no one listens. I am small, I am afraid, and I would like to be brave. The phrase sits in my mouth like a warm stone. I repeat it until it becomes a rhythm. I keep a list of debts in my head that clacks like a metronome. We have 3 months of mortgage unpaid. I can hear the bank's letterhead when the post slides on the table. The empty apartment we once rented is a silent accusation. The money that used to be there evaporated like a morning mist. I cannot sleep. I count the second hand as if pace could buy time back. Each night is a thin film of light through curtains and the distant hum of a city that does not slow for my counting. Night brings a different set of rituals. I wake at odd hours and sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee I do not finish. The light is blue and thin. I scroll through old emails and stare at names of clients like charms that failed to work. I practiced architecture for 30 years. I have drawings in the closet that smell like other people's homes. My hands remember the arc of a compass even when my head is fogged. That memory is stubborn in me. It keeps tugging at something that wants to make again. I had started to believe that wanting was dangerous. Wanting meant preparing for disappointment. So I learned to tone down desire. I stopped looking at advertisements for cars. I stopped allowing myself the private imagining of a different life. I told myself dreaming was selfish. That was another habit: smother the want and survive. The cage of survival is clever. It offers safety in exchange for the small death of aspiration. And then, one night when the apartment felt too large and I was a small thing inside it, the air changed. I noticed it first as a pressure behind my teeth, like the room was holding its breath. I noticed the silence sharpen. The sound of Diana breathing even seemed to pause. The world moved a fraction slower, as if someone had pressed a finger against the rim of a glass, and it began to sing. Before I continue, thank you for listening to this story. I am just starting a channel to read these nights aloud. If you feel held by these words, please subscribe. Every new person helps us find the 1,000 voices I believe are out there. Tell me where you are, your city, your country, in the comments. It matters. It keeps this true. It keeps me brave. That night, I went to the bedroom, and the clock showed 3:33. The numbers glowed with a strange certainty. A soft vibration ran through the windows, like the sound of a distant engine that had no business being so close. My skin prickled. My breath left as a small cloud in the air. I did not turn on the lamp. I stood in the dark, and something in the corner began to bloom. It was blue at first, a slow, deep blue like the inside of a whale. It gathered itself like a tide. The shape elongated, not quite human, but suggesting a posture I could recognize as attention. The light did not sit on surfaces. It hung a few inches above them, as if gravity had not yet decided whether to claim it. I wanted to laugh with the absurdity, and the laugh died like a moth. I tried to make a sound. My voice would not move the way I thought it would. My throat felt like cotton. Diana lay beside me breathing. Her hand was warm against the sheet. The thing approached without steps. It did not make a sound. It carried a presence like an old book placed carefully on a table. Then a voice came, not through the air, but from inside my head. It was close and not my own. It said my name with the ease of someone calling a neighbor across a fence. Miguel. The word pressed against my ribs and somehow also warmed my temples. You have fear of all you could be, it said. The phrase was simple and terrible. It lodged somewhere behind my sternum. The blue light bore 2 points like eyes, but they were not eyes. They felt like questions. I swallowed. My mouth felt dry. I wanted to ask what it was. I wanted to demand proof. Instead, I found my hands doing something tiny. They reached for my sketchbook that always sat near the bed, and my fingers closed around the leather cover like a lifeline. The being extended what I could only call a hand, made of the same soft blue glow, and it did not touch me. There was no heat when it stopped. There was only the sensation of an invitation. I remember thinking, either I am about to be robbed of my mind, or I am being invited into something vast. The thought landed and did not solve anything. When it spoke again, it was neither cruel nor kind. It was precise. I am called Agumar by those who name me, it said. The sound of the name traveled like a pebble dropped into a wide lake. The patterns of light around it shifted and made small, geometrical waves. I felt them behind my eyes, like the afterimage of sunlight on water. I said, in a whisper that surprised me with its steadiness, "Why are you here?" The voice that answered did not use the word why. It moved in images. It offered a hand that was not a hand, but a suggestion of touch. To show you the shape of the barrier you hold, it said. To show you that the fear you carry is also the doorway. I felt the words not just in my mind, but behind my ribs. For the first time in months, I noticed a small change in my breathing. It lengthened in a way that made room. The air seemed cooler but less hostile, as if the room had shifted to accommodate a truth that had been waiting. There was a small, impossible thing in that moment. A soft click from my phone across the room. A notification lit the screen. An old client had forwarded a thank you email, an amount small but exact, a number that matched something the room had asked me to consider in a dream the night before. I stared. The blue light pulsed once, like a gentle answer. I could have rationalized. I could have set the episode down as sleep paralysis or exhaustion. I had learned to be generous to myself in explanation. But the image of the blue shape, the voice in my head, and the tiny ping of the phone braided together into a new knot. It did not undo my fear. It did not repay the mortgage. But it was the first time since the accounts dried up that something outside my list responded, as if to a note I had hummed. The presence lingered. The room smelled faintly of metal and rain. The next 3 nights would tell me which was stronger, the world as it had been, or a different order answering to a quieter frequency. The second night came with a quieter certainty. I didn't sleep. I waited. I stood in the small pool of lamplight beside the bed and watched the clock. 3:33. The numbers blinked as if someone else were counting with me. The air was colder than the night before. My breath drew out white and thin. This time, when the blue gathered, it felt closer, like someone stepping into a room I had already half remembered. "Close your eyes and breathe," the voice suggested. Not spoken to my ears, given as a small command that landed behind my sternum. I obeyed because obedience is sometimes simpler than fear. I pressed my palms to my thighs and felt the grain of the fabric. The apartment smelled like dust and a faint citrus cleaner Diana used. I felt the radiator behind me, steady and mechanical. Those small anchors kept me appearing human while something else rearranged. Through my eyelids I saw lines, threads of light running from object to object. They connected the bookshelf to my wristwatch, the lamp to Diana's sleeping hair, the sketchbook to the table leg. They shimmered like fine fishing line made of light. The threads didn't look like explanations. They looked like a map I had not been given permission to read. "What you call reality is a responsive field," the voice said. "Thought emits a frequency. Emotion feeds it. Together they sculpt what becomes." My immediate reaction was clinical suspicion. I have read enough to argue both sides of miracles. I tested myself. Is this hypnagogic hallucination? Am I losing my mind? I thought, trying to keep my tone flat, as if I were a scientist asking a question in a lab. Agomar, or the voice, responded with an image rather than a lecture. A clock on the bedside table changed its numbers in a slow cascade. 4:44. I felt a small lurch in my chest. At that precise instant, my phone face down on the dresser lit up. A notification. A transfer. The sum matched a number that had been rolling through my dream from the night before. I checked the sender. It was an old client who I had not expected to remember me. The math of it was small, concrete, and ridiculous. My hands trembled. For a man who lives by drawing and measure, that kind of precision is its own language. I had been taught to respect exactness. This was an exactness that arrived without a contract. It opened a tiny door inside me I had bolted shut. "Coincidence," I said aloud, though the words sounded thin. "There are no coincidences," Agomar answered. The light around it made tiny geometric patterns, triangles, circles that dangled and dissolved like ornaments. "There is cosmic arithmetic you have not yet learned to read." I wanted to push back. My training in architecture has an appetite for proof. I make models. Models require rules. So Agomar proposed a protocol. "Today you will create with intent. Choose something believable. Begin small." I felt my mind search for an immediate, practical ask. A new client who could pay enough to cover the next few bills. I pictured a man in a suit, a handshake, a deposit. The image came tight with fear. The voice declined. "There is too much fear there," it said. "Choose something you can hold without doubt." I thought of a coffee with Ernest Romano, my college friend who drifted to interior design while I stayed with plans and permits. The picture of him in a cafe was soft. I could see the noise of cups, the smell of burnt sugar, the warmth of a chair. This I could believe. "Fine," I said. "Close your eyes," Agomar instructed. "Immerse. Feel the grip of the cup. Smell the coffee. Hear the clink. Most important, feel gratitude, as if it had already happened." I did as he said. I formed the small scene. Ernest arrived late. We embraced like men making up years. We laughed about small failures, and he spoke a line about a project that could use my perspective. I held the gratitude like a seed between my ribs. I felt ridiculous and oddly calm. "Now abandon it," the voice said. "Do not check. Do not prod. Doubt cancels." I left the visualization like a letter folded into a drawer. The next morning, I opened my email and there was a message from Ernest. He was in town. He wanted to meet. He had seen my name in a small feature in a design piece and thought we might work on something together. The message was said like a friend saying hello, but beneath it there was potential. A door had been nudged. At the cafe, I could taste the cloying sweetness of nostalgia. Ernest's hair had a few new gray streaks. His laugh was the same. He asked about my work. I pivoted to the wrong axis. Fear and proof still tangled me, and I said the thing I shouldn't have. I've been seeing things at night. He changed. Concern replaced the easy smile. Miguel, are you sleeping? Diana is worried, he said, and the word worry landed heavy. He offered help almost before I could ask for it. He suggested a doctor. He told me the story of someone he knew who had similar visions, and how it ended badly. The kindness in his voice was an attempt to hold a man who might be unraveling. On the walk home, I felt small. Partly because the world called my experience a symptom. Partly because admitting to contact with something unknown makes you, socially, an oddity. I came home to Diana waiting with folded hands and an exhausted compassion. She had been on the phone. She had called our cousin. She had called a psychiatrist. This was all practical. This was human. It was also the kind of pressure designed to make me return to the ledger. I wanted to scream that this was real. I wanted to show her the threads of light. I wanted proof that a deposit could arrive on a whim, that a meeting could be made from a scene held with gratitude. Instead, I felt cornered by love that could not yet understand the language I was learning. That night, I asked Agamar for a demonstration that would not stand on feeling. I asked for something repeatable, something that would force even the ledger to bend. He waited. If a presence can wait. Then he gave instruction like an old teacher. Choose a test that touches your life, but is not life or death. Make it small. Prepare your senses. Write the intention, then think it into being. I followed the protocol with a nervousness I have never felt before. I took the chair by the window, the draft cooling my neck. I smelled my coffee, grounded my posture, and I wrote the intention on a scrap of paper. A small payment from a past client. A phone call from someone who could reconnect me to work. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. I spoke aloud, awkwardly, like a child learning a song. I am willing to hold the fear. I am willing to accept the next small thing. A loop formed in my throat. I hold the fear. I opened the door. I let the proof come. At dawn the phone rang. It was Paulo Santiago, a man who had said no to a project months earlier. He said he had changed his mind. He wanted to expand the concept to 5 locations and could advance 40% of the fee. My knees went weak and I sat. The paper in my pocket had warmed. Diana came in with the mail. An envelope from a major magazine sat on the table. A small project of mine was to be featured on the cover. The room felt suddenly full of air. We couldn't claim the mortgage was paid, but the ledger had shifted. A tear came uninvited to my eye. It was not the end, but it was a turning. I understood then that the test Agamar proposed was not a trick. It was a retraining of my attention. He had not promised riches. He promised to make the field responsive to the clarity of my intention and the temperature of my gratitude. In the evenings after, Agamar's light felt less like an intruder and more like a compass. He spoke in small aphorisms that hung in the room like dust motes. Emotion is the motor. Thought is the map, he said once, and the pattern of light in the corner answered him with a ripple. Acceptance fuels the movement. Gratitude ignites the engine. His words were not a recipe, they were a rehearsal. They asked me to practice a posture. I tested it like an apprentice. I said mantras in my head that were not trite but oddly specific. I hold the fear and watch it become a door. I am the memory of the life I intend. I feel gratitude for what has not yet arrived. I repeated those loops until the phrases moved from words into gesture. I stood straighter. I breathed slower. I opened emails with a different steadiness. The work began to reappear not as a blizzard of miracles, but as small, cumulative acts. Calls returned, sketches requested, an editor asking for a talk. Each sign built trust, not just with the world, but with a deeper part of me. Not everyone noticed. Ernest remained cautious. Friends offered sympathy. Diana learned to wait at the edge of belief and love. And I learned an odd humility. I closed my eyes and thought of the office full of people again, of paper and coffee and laughter. I felt not the panic I had felt before, but a quiet muscle of certainty. The test had not made everything safe. It had made me an instrument. Agamar's light faded like a curtain. Before he left, he placed something, not a talisman, but a fragment of light that lingered in my hand for a second, warm and translucent. When doubt takes you, hold this as a reminder, he said, not to anchor you to the past, but to recall the posture. I watched him dissolve into the shape of the room. The blue receded like tide. I felt the apartment press back into its ordinary proportions. But something new lived under the ordinary now. The ledger still existed, but it felt negotiable. The fear still surfaced. It now had a rhythm and a place. That night, I fell asleep with my hand in my sketchbook and woke with the scent of coffee in my pillow. The work had begun to pull me forward, not as an external rescue, but as a change in how I moved through the world. The experiments had not promised certainty. They had offered a method, clarity, feeling, gratitude, and then abandonment. The method fit into my day like a scaffold. There is a question that rose and has not left me. If the field answers to the tone of our attention, what happens when a whole city learns to tune? What happens when millions hold a small, shared intention? The thought is dizzying and humble at once. The next night, the blue light did not need to appear to be felt. I woke at 3:33 with a peacefulness that felt like a vow kept. I sat by the window and watched the light of the streetcars making simple patterns in the dark. The voice that had once felt like an invasion now felt like a mentor, slow and precise. He had offered me one rule and a practice. I had followed enough to see the rule respond. Agamar's last instruction before he dissolved was simple and urgent. Embrace the fear. Use it like a door. He smiled. If a presence without a face can be said to smile, and in that smile I heard not a teacher but a mirror. He left me with a small stone of blue light, a reminder of what I had been taught. It warmed my palm and went cold like a memory. I still wake to the clock. I still sometimes count the seconds. But now, when the fear arrives, I place my hand over it and say the loops that are mine. I hold the fear. I open the door. I let evidence come. The loops are short, but they are a rhythm. They are not magic spells. They are practice. There are people who will say this sounds like madness. There are nights when I wonder the same. But there are results I can show. The calls, the envelope, the renewed work. Those things are not magic in the way that novels make magic. They are the output of a mind retrained to notice and to feel. The ledger is still there, but now it is part of a larger ledger that includes proof, practice, and a strange, patient teacher who taught me to hold my fear rather than run from it. Tomorrow I will go to the office and slide a sheet of paper across the table and begin again. The life I sketch will no longer be only on paper. It will be something I tend, like a garden, and sometimes surprisingly it will respond. The second night felt less like intrusion and more like an appointment I had somehow remembered at the last minute. The clock read 3:33 again, a thin certainty on the bedside table. The air had the taste of copper and old paper. I could hear the building's settle little sighs in the plumbing, and beneath that a new sound, so subtle it might have been the apartment clearing its throat. Agamar arrived like a tide, blue folding into the corner with the hush of velvet. He did not flicker. The light steadied, as if the room had been allowed to breathe differently. I was aware first of temperature. The skin at my forearms cooled, then warmed as if the light brushed past. My lungs lengthened, pulling slow, deliberate breaths. The presence taught my body a quieter tempo. Close your eyes, he intoned inside my head, simple and sure. When I did, the dark behind my lids became not absence but texture. Threads traced from my sketchbook to the mug on the shelf, from Diana's hair to the radiator, from my chest to the photograph of an early project pinned on the wall. The threads were not literal. They were like the memory of a string seen by feeling. I followed one line with my attention until it hummed. It linked a drawing I had abandoned months ago to the email app in my phone. The hum became a tone. The tone became a small, precise ache under my ribs, anticipation or warning. I could not say which. Then my phone across the room lit up. A notification. A number. 717 Brazilian reals flickered on the screen like someone quoting a tiny, private miracle. My fingers trembled. I kept my eyes shut and let my chest register the proof as if it were a temperature reading. The field had responded while I watched a thread. The effect was ridiculous in its specificity. A client I had not spoken to in years had sent an exact amount I had thought of as a random number seconds earlier. The room smelled faintly of lemon and metal, as if a new logic had ascent. Agamar's voice was soft, not lecturing. You think in measures. Good. Measure the small. Build the scale. His light folded into geometric ripples when he spoke, triangles becoming circles, then dissolving. He did not explain the mechanism. He offered a protocol. Attention is a signal. Emotion is the amplifier. Intend with the map of your hands. I wanted to argue my training hangs on drawing lines that hold weight. I wanted the how. Instead, I let curiosity be the honest response. I imagined the threads again, this time tracing them with purpose, from a modest invoice to the bank app, from a coffee date to a renewed client. Each thread vibrated differently, depending on how I felt while I watched it. Fear made the line brittle. Gratitude made it glow. He asked me to choose something small and believable. The request was almost cruel in its kindness. My mind wanted a rescue. My chest knew rescue would look like a series of tiny, dependable knots. Begin with what you can feel without shame, he said. Not what you want to brag about. What you can carry. I pictured a coffee with an old friend. I pictured the chair, the weight of a cup, the rustle of a newspaper. I let gratitude sit in my sternum like a stone warmed in the sun. Then Agamar said the rule I would repeat to myself until it burned into habit. Feel it, thank it, let it go. Gratitude as a command, not as an afterthought. When I opened my eyes, the room looked the same. The clock ticked, but now there were threads I could fold into my pocket. I slid my hand under the pillow and felt for the small leather sketchbook I never slept without. The page I chose to run my thumb along had a doodle I had made 3 years ago, just lines, but they looked like a promise now. I left the night with a single experiment in my pocket and a smaller, sharper hope. If the field moved to the temperature of my feeling, then the practice would be to tune that temperature. I whispered a loop into the dark, testing whether ritual could hold power. I named the want. I feel the want as if it is already true. I thank the world for answering. I folded the words like paper. Something small now waited. Something accountable. The first demonstration had been given, but Agamar promised a larger proof. He smiled, or the light made a shape that felt like a smile, and the shape closed the night like a hinge. The next test, he said, would require not only belief but restraint. I would have to leave the door shut and trust whatever came through it. A quieter alarm sounded in me. To trust without proof is dangerous. To refuse trust when proof begins to arrive is reckless. I went to bed with the echo of Agamar's last line, measure small, build scale. The promise of a second demonstration hung in the air, and I felt the ledger on the table like a thing that could be rebalanced if I learned the math of attention. The next morning the world would ask for receipts. The night had offered me a method. Mini cliffhanger. I held the proof in my palm like a coin and heard in my head the instruction that would ask me to create deliberately, not for need, but for calibration. The field wanted practice. The next step would ask for ritual and patience. The stakes felt modest and enormous at once. The instruction was simple and oddly domestic. Choose a target small enough that doubt could not swallow it. Agamar's voice folded around the words like a hand around a cup. Create like you test a hinge. See the movement. Feel the click. I set the scene. I cleaned the table beside the lamp until my hands knew the texture of the wood. I brewed coffee not to drink, but to anchor my senses, the smell, the heat on my palms, the bead of steam that lifted and dissolved. Preparation matters, he had said, because the body remembers posture before. Ernest was in town. He wanted coffee. He mentioned an article he'd seen mentioning my name. The message was casual, as if it could be shrugged off. I sat with the letter in my lap and felt the small muscle of trust flex. The first deliberate experiment had landed without fanfare, and the landing itself became a tiny revolution in me. Possibility no longer had to be loud to be true. I practiced again, pushing the protocol. Prepare senses, name intention, feel gratitude, abandon. I varied the scale. A tiny payment appeared for a past consultation exactly as I had pictured. A call from a former contractor asking if I could consult on a small renovation showed up, like someone remembering a neighbor. Each sign was not a fortune, but a stitch. They sewed a seam in the ledger. Between experiments, I kept the practice private. I noticed how my body changed. My shoulders softened, the tightness in my throat eased. I walked with a different rhythm, less furtive, more paced. Friends commented that I looked lighter. Diana noticed too. She asked what was different. I answered with smallness: coffee, emails, a magazine mention, and with no metaphysics. She liked concrete things. At the cafe, I saw Ernest and felt the old scaffolding of friendship hold us. We talked about trivialities: first kids, a mutual professor now retired. Then he shifted. He had seen a mention of my name. He asked if I was taking on new projects. I did not leap. I described instead a trouble I could solve for him, a measured piece of work that fit his needs. He listened like a man who sorts tools. But then, in a moment of excess honesty, I told him about the nights. I told him the thing had been a teacher and that it insisted I practice gratitude as if the world already answered. His face closed in the way of a man who hears a story that threatens to rearrange his categories. "You need to sleep, Miguel," he said gently. "This sounds like stress." The voice held care, but under it was a steady disbelief that felt almost institutional. He suggested a doctor. He offered a name of a psychiatrist like a voucher. Returning home, the brightness of the cafe dulled. I had expected various reactions, but not the immediate medical framing. Diana had already spoken with our cousin and sounded even more exhausted than before. She held the envelope with the psychiatrist's number between two fingers like a fragile object. Worry had a kind of armor. It protected her from the unknown by naming it. I felt split open in a new way. The field had given me signs. The world gave me diagnosis. Both had claims on me. I had to show that the method worked without falling into arrogance, and I had to keep my marriage intact without hiding truth. I promised Diana to get evaluated, if only to buy time. She accepted that as a compromise. Agamar watched these negotiations without interruption. "Resistance will come from those who measure by a single ruler," he said once. "You must learn to hold two languages at once: careful speech for the world and a listening body for the field." So I learned to translate. At a doctor's appointment, I described my sleep, my anxiety, the tremor in my hands. I did not mention threads or blue light. The doctor prescribed tests, cautioned rest, and offered a referral to therapy. It was a human map of human problems. It was not incompatible with what I had begun to believe about the field. It simply occupied a different register. I carried on with small experiments in private, sharpening the practice into a habit. One morning, I placed a folded scrap in my pocket asking for a payment from an old client, not an extravagant request, just enough to cover one overdue bill. I anchored the feeling with sensory detail: the weight of the envelope on the table, the sound of a kitchen drawer, the smell of stale coffee. I held gratitude like a song. Midday the transfer came. Not a windfall, but a precise amount that balanced one sheet of the ledger. I sat down hard in my office chair and laughed, quietly and with too many tears for the moment. Diana opened the door and read my face like a weather report. We breathed together, and the room felt like both of ours again. Each successful experiment honed my method. Each short failure taught calibration. Too much hunger made the thread snap. Too much expectation blurred the line's pulse. The rules were practical and, strangely, merciful. They asked for honest feeling, not fantasies of grandeur. They asked me to create a habit of trust. I invented 2 short loops that I used like tuning phrases, different from the ones I had whispered in the beginning. I feel it as already true. I think as if it has arrived. And I breathe into the want. I let the want breathe back. They were small, mechanical, intimate. I said them aloud sometimes, like a man testing a new tool in his hands. Mini cliffhanger. With practice came a pattern. Signals were accumulating, and a larger test loomed, the kind that would not be satisfied by small payments or casual meetings. Agomar hinted that calibration could scale, but scaling would require a new willingness. The ledger's biggest line still hung over us. The next ask would be steadier and harder to keep private. The resistance arrived as bodies and voices, arranged in ordinary clothes. It was not dramatic. It was domestic and practical and, in that way, far more dangerous. Ernesto's caution had been the first ripple. His concern transformed into a phone call to Diana that afternoon, an exchange that was meant to be helpful and landed like a judgment. She held our life measured between her thumb and forefinger. I understood. She had watched our savings thin like paint, and she had the ledger in sharper focus than I did. Love, in her hands, became a series of precautions. When Diana told me Ernest had suggested a psychiatrist, the word landed with the weight of a legal notice. "You need help," she said softly, as if the softness could make it less final. I met her eyes and saw the ledger again. I felt guilt like a worn strap. I did not argue. I kept my voice measured and agreed to an appointment. Compromise felt like survival. The world outside our apartment offered other noises. A letter from the bank arrived in the morning mail with the exact, terrible rhythm of an ultimatum. Final notice. 30 days. The paper smelled of machine ink and inevitability. The field had given me small stitches. The bank kept demanding a whole cloak. I spoke with the psychiatrist in a room painted the color of waiting. I described sleep patterns, appetite, and the tremor in my hands. I did not mention blue light or threads. The doctor listened with a professional softness and recommended a plan of therapy and medication if needed. It was pragmatic and lacked the poetry of Agomar, but the doctor's notes had a kind of authority. In the clinic hallway, a woman wheeled herself past with a ring of keys at her belt, and I felt an ordinary solidarity with human care. Ernesto's skepticism persisted. He offered phrases designed to protect him from change, stress, burnout, psychosis. He meant kindness. He meant to anchor me. But his words cut. They forced me to translate my interior experience into a language that made sense to him. I tried. The translation felt insufficient. At night, alone, I would ask Agomar why human sanity must be defended by those we love. The light answered in a pattern more like weather than an explanation. You were not given a script that everyone would understand. You were given a practice you must prove. Proof will write itself into the ledger if you are patient. Doubt crept in like a thin shadow across a page. The proof I had already gathered: emails, small payments, the magazine envelope were factual. Yet each fact could be read as coincidence. The more ordinary people insisted on medical models, the more I felt the need to hold both realities without betraying either. I found myself rehearsing a twin narrative, a practical, bankable explanation for the world, and an interior practice that changed the map of my attention. "Will you be honest with me?" Diana asked one evening, her fingers worrying the turquoise pendant at her throat. The pendant flashed against her skin like a little blue moon. I could have told her everything about the blue light blooming at 3:33, about threads, about gratitude that functioned like a machine. Instead, I offered the truth I could share without breaking the bridge between us. The experiments are changing things. Small proofs have come. I am not surrendering to delusion. I am practicing a discipline. Her eyes held hope mingled with fear. Hope because a man she loved was seemingly moving. Fear because the movement came with gestures she could not name. We settled, as many couples do, into a compromise of observation. She would support practical steps appointments, medication if needed. I would keep the practice and be transparent about Diana, and I convened like two captains over a map. We counted, subtracted, made lists. The math was brutal and persuasive. It said, act now or lose this place where we made our life together. Late at night, I whispered to Agomar, if you are practical, give me a proof I cannot offer the world as coincidence. Give me a movement that unrolls the ledger with a single, undeniable fold. He did not answer in the way I expected. Instead, he gave me instruction precise and oddly architectural. Create a test that touches the ledger directly, he said. Not by begging, not by forcing. Use the posture you have built. Bookend it with gratitude and clear intention. Then release. The test had rules. It would be public enough that others could see it, but private enough to be mine. It would ask me to hold fear and not be ashamed of it. It would require surrender, not manipulation. And if it worked, it would not simply fill a number on a bank app. It would alter the trajectory of our months. I prepared. I set the environment in the office as if laying out a model. Lamp on, compass on the table, the page with a simple plan folded into quarters. I breathed. I said the loops out loud, new variants that felt like a hammer and a tuning fork. I named the fear. I feel the fear and hold it like a good stone. I opened the door within and asked the world to step through. Morning came, and with it the ledger's harsh light. I moved through the day with a quietness that felt like an offering. At 7:15 the phone rang. It was a voice I had expected and not expected, the businessman Paulo Santiago, who months earlier had said no. He spoke of reconsideration and scale and, in a single sentence, asked if we could proceed with all 5 locations. He could advance 40% of the fee that afternoon. The line went cold in my hands. My knees failed me for a half second. The paper on my desk warmed where my palm rested. Diana walked in with the mail. Between overdue notices and polite solicitations, there was an envelope from the country's leading architecture magazine. Inside, my work was selected for publication on a page I had hoped would exist someday. The ledger did not vanish. The bank's letter still lived on the table. But something in the math shifted. Tears came that I did not try to name. They were not triumph or vindication. They were an animal recognition that the field and the world had, for a moment, agreed. The proof was not a miracle in the theatrical sense. It was a closing of a gap I had been living in for months. But the victory did not erase the resistance. If anything, it made the next horizon sharper. Ernesto called. He asked if I would slow down. Diana hugged me and admitted fear still lived between the two of us. The doctor scheduled follow UPS. The bank required documentation. Reality did not dissolve into a single answer. It multiplied into new responsibilities. And in the small hours, when the apartment slept but for the radiator's click, I took the blue stone Agomar had given me and rolled it between my fingers. It was cool and then warm. It did not promise safety. It promised a posture. Mini cliffhanger. I had pushed the ledger enough to create a new path, but the test's success asked a larger question: what will I become if the field continues to answer? The mentor had taught me to hold fear like a door. I had opened it. Now I had to live on the other side. The night before the appointment, I sat in the dark office and let the room be exactly what it was: a small rectangle of lamplight, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the paper smell of old plans stacked like a small city. The radiator clicked in slow metronome. My hands knew the edges of the desk. My throat carried a stone I had named fear for months. I did what Agomar had taught me, only this time the instruction felt heavier because the stakes were a house and a marriage. I breathed the room in. I named the fear aloud. I am afraid of losing this home, of my name becoming a footnote, of Diana learning to live without me. The words did something strange. They did not dissolve the fear. They showed me its shape, the exact weight in my chest, the way it sat like a coin on a scale. I closed my eyes and built the scene I wanted with more fidelity than I ever had before. Not the vague image of success, but tactile details. My assistant opening the office door and laughing. A blueprint spread across the drafting table. The feel of a new roll of tracing paper under my fingers. The smell of coffee, then not stale, but bright. I named the small wins at the edge of the big one. I breathed into each detail until the scene had textures and sound and a kind of density that felt honest. Then I said a short loop out loud, one I had not used before. I meet the fear. I hold the fear. I let the life I ask for recognize me. The phrase landed like a hinge somewhere behind my sternum. I folded my hands, then folded a scrap of paper and placed it in my pocket. The old ritual, but simple. Gratitude. Image. Release. Morning arrived with a thin blue light over the city. At 7:15 the phone rang. I almost missed it because I sat too still, listening for consequences. Paulo Santiago's voice was brisk through the speaker. He spoke about the restaurants with the kind of practical sentences that erase months of no. He said he had changed his mind. He wanted the project for all 5 units. He offered 40% up front. His words hung in the kitchen air like a coin dropped into a jar. The paper on the table warmed where my hand had rested. Diana came in with the morning mail. Her fingers moved slow when she handed me an envelope from the architecture magazine. The cover image inside was of a building I had designed years ago, selected, not featured, but selected for a spread. The type smelled of glossy ink and a future I had not let myself write. I did not shout. I did not put on music. I sat down and laughed until my chest spasmed. Tears cut clean paths down my face. They were not the triumphant kind. They were recognition. The field and the ledger had agreed, however briefly. The bank still wanted documents. The psychiatrist appointment still sat on the calendar. Ernesto still held his polite skepticism. But for the first time in months, the numbers on the page could be moved by something other than bargaining and exhaustion. There was a quiet aftermath. I called Paulo back and set a meeting. I scanned the magazine pages and sent them to Diana with a message that said only, "Look." She read them with the pendant at her throat trembling. She said nothing grand. She folded herself around the small fact like a warm blanket. The apartment felt less like an infirmary and more like a house again. I went to the psychiatrist and told him what I had promised about sleep, appetite, tremor. I did not speak of threads or blue light. He prescribed tests and a plan. He offered tools. The human map felt necessary and honest. I kept the appointment because I had promised Diana. I kept it because being accountable in 2 languages was a muscle I needed to build. At night, I rolled the blue stone Agomar had given me across my palm. It felt cool. It did not hum. It did not contain an answer. It was a presence shaped to remind me of posture. I slept with the sense that the test had not concluded. The morning's calls had shifted my world, but they also widened the responsibility around it. The mind is greedy for explanation. I could have said coincidence. I could have said timing. I chose instead to sit with the felt truth and to keep the practice small, methodical, careful. I tightened one ritual. Before I answered any call, I set an interior frame image, gratitude, release. It changed the quality of my voice. Clients said I sounded calmer or clearer. The ledger, for the first time, felt like a page I could read and write into. Even with proof, resistance multiplied. Ernesto texted the next day, politely cautious. Diana admitted she still woke at 3 every night to check the alarm. The bank asked for paperwork. It was as if the world required documentation in ever more precise forms. The miracles did not cancel the grind. They threaded through it, like light through window blinds. In the early hours, alone with the radiator, I asked Agomar a question the way a child asks where the line on a map goes. He did not answer in words. He gave me a cadence. Create the test that touches the ledger directly, not by begging, but by holding the posture of one who already receives. Then he stepped closer to something like a plan and said, simply, end it with gratitude, then leave the room of wanting. I understood, with a clarity that tasted like iron and tea, that the next step would demand public-facing faith. The next test would have to shift not only the ledger, but my standing within the world that had been skeptical. It would have to be both small and I hold the fear. I let the life I asked for recognize me. Saying them felt different in the presence of the mentor. The loops were no longer private prayers. They were instruments. Agamar did not correct me. He expanded. He laid out the architecture of practice in sentences that looked like instructions and felt like parables. Think like a builder, he said. Not with blueprints alone. Feel the materials. Choose the joint. Test the hinge. Gratitude is not magic. It is a seal that signals completion to the field. He demonstrated with light. Patterns unfolded across the air, hexagons that clicked into one another like the facets of a stone. Each pattern carried a rule. Specificity trumps vagueness. Feeling is frequency. Steadiness is the amplifier. He taught in small phrases that landed and lingered. Name the end. Feel the end. Do not thirst for the middle. He paused then, and the pause had weight. Release the how. I translated into actions I could repeat without the mentor present. I wrote them down then and there on the corner of an envelope. 1. Prepare the senses. Light, touch, temperature. Make the scene credible to the body. 2. State the intention with a clear noun and a precise verb. No nebulous wishes. 3. Anchor with gratitude as if the situation were a memory already lived. 4. Abandon the want. Do not chase. Do not tweak. Observe. Agamar added 2 operational loops that became my daily tools. He asked me to make them my own, to find the cadence in my mouth. Loop A, I name it. I feel it. I think as if it were already here. Loop B, I breathe into the want. I let the want breathe back. I closed the door with a quiet hand. They sounded almost silly spoken aloud. They worked like a key. Is this selfish? I asked. If I ask and the world answers, what becomes of those still waiting? What of responsibility? He made a gesture and the light softened into long, book-like shadows. Responsibility is the currency of creation, he said. If you create carelessly, you fracture. If you create from steadiness, you repair more than you take. Use your requests as commitments. He gave me exercises to translate the idea into habit. A morning practice to begin the day, 2 minutes of sensory naming, 1 minute of gratitude for one small thing, a concrete action logged on paper. An evening practice, a gratitude ledger, 3 details I did not have a week before. A public practice. Choose one intention you can place where others will see it. Not to boast, but to calibrate the field to the community. He urged caution. Do not replace effort with spectacle, he warned. Walk your work. Pay your bills. Accept the doctor's map. The field is not a quick fix for negligence. This was the part one needed. The mentor never promised that the world would stop asking for proof. He offered a way to live in both grammars, the scientific ledger and the field's response. He taught that the two could be harmonized by posture and by plain language. He stepped closer and placed the blue stone into my open hand. Its surface had veins of paler light, like a river caught in glass. When doubt rises, he said, hold this and remember posture. When you forget the method, fall back to the ritual. Prepare, name, feel, thank, release. You will forget, then you will remember. His last lesson was a small paradox, designed to be practiced rather than solved. You are not ordering the world, he said softly. You are recognizing the pattern that is waiting to be remembered. You are not the maker of destiny. You are the witness of what remembers itself. I asked him for words to use when I had to explain myself in the language of others. Diana, the bank, Ernesto. He gave me a sentence I learned to say with no apology and no defensiveness. I am using 2 kinds of tools at once, practical steps and an inner practice. I am accountable to both. That phrase became a bridge. Diana heard it and nodded, slower than I would have liked, but she heard me. Ernesto heard it and nodded as well, his mouth tightening into a smile that was almost a truce. Before he left, Agamar looked at the small stone in my palm and said, Do not make an idol of it. Make a habit of it. The field responds to posture more than to objects. He dissolved then, not with drama, but like a curtain pulled aside. The room was the same rectangle of lamplight. The air smelled faintly of coffee. I sat with a list of steps I could repeat. I felt both lighter and more burdened in a useful way. The next morning I stood at the window and spoke the loops quietly aloud. My voice sounded steady, like a tool. I carried that steadiness into the meeting with Paolo. I carried it into the email to the magazine editor. I carried it into an honest conversation with Diana about boundaries and money and the slow rehabilitation of trust. Education had become practice. The code was not a sermon. It was an operating system. Mini cliffhanger. The stone would be tested not by luck, but by an action I would have to make visible to the world. Agamar left me with a symbol and a set of habits. He did not sign the contract for my life. He left instructions for how to live it. That is an important distinction, because miracles without work create brittle pride. What I received was more durable, a way to move. In the months that followed, the change unfurled slowly. Project leads arrived with manners that looked ordinary: a message, a forwarded contact, a lunch invitation, but the pattern was different. I stopped chasing each success as if it were a single tree. I learned to read the forest of small proofs. The blue stone sat in the drawer of my desk, rarely needed. Often I only rolled it once between my fingers before a call. Sometimes I would touch it under the table while Diana and I shared the evening news, a secret knot of steadiness I did not have to explain. It ceased to be a talisman and became a tool for posture. The ritual itself was small. Prepare the senses, name the intention in one precise sentence, feel the gratitude as if I were remembering, then let go. Diana watched the changes with a mix of admiration and cautious relief. She asked for transparency and for proof in the ledger. I began to record micro wins with her. Invoices paid, a reliable contractor, a lecture booked. These were not miracles to me alone. They were stitches in our shared life. Ernesto visited once more, less as a critic and more as a man checking a worksite. He brought his usual polish and a head full of practical questions. We spoke frankly about process and responsibility. He still laughed at the weirdness of my nights, but his laughter had less steel to it. He asked for my advice on a tiny commercial fit-out. I said yes. I began teaching the method in small ways, not on stages at first, but in conversations over coffee with a young architect haunted by bills, in a quiet evening with an old client unsure whether to expand. I would say the loops out loud. I made a pocket script to help people learn the sequence: prepare, name, feel, thank, release. People wrote them down. People tried them. They sent me cautious successes, a small job, a cleared payment, a reconciliation with a brother. When the magazine called to invite me to a series of talks, I realized how the world had folded around the practice. Not because I had shouted, but because the field had been taught to respond to a steady posture. The lectures were practical and honest. I described rituals and spreadsheet discipline in the same sentence. I never claimed the field as an alternative to responsibility. Quite the opposite, I framed it as a discipline that amplifies responsible action. Buying the car was an oddly private chapter. I went to the dealership with Diana. The salesman, bright tie, polite smile, handed me the keys with the ritual of commerce. The car smelled of leather and new plastic. When I sat behind the wheel, I did not feel like a man entering a trophy. I felt like someone taking possession of a new capacity: time, mobility, the ability to meet clients across the city without the long commute that had been stealing small hours from my work. Diana squeezed my hand as I slid the keys into my pocket. She said, quietly, "You look like yourself again." The stone never glowed or hummed at the dealership. It stayed cool in my palm. But later that night, on a narrow highway with rain on the windshield, I turned it over between my fingers and felt a deep, steady calm. It was not about the car. It was about a posture that had become real in my body. Not everything changed. Some friends drifted away. Some creditors remained stern. I still went to the psychiatrist and did the tests. I remained vigilant about my sleep. The field did not grant me immunity from ordinary human limits. With suggestion, a message, if such a thing can be said about light. Keep the posture, teach the method, be accountable. A stranger wrote to me asking permission to share my story. It felt like a small door opening into something that might be larger than my life, but not because I had chased fame, because a method had been made practical and people recognized a practice they could try. I do not pretend it is a universal solution. There were ethical decisions to make. I refused a client whose values clashed with ours. I insisted on paying a subcontractor early when possible. The practice invited a kind of moral hygiene. That was one of Agamar's quieter teachings. Influence is responsibility. Diana and I developed a language of our own. When bills crowded the table, we would do a short pairing. 2 minutes of preparation, 1 sentence of gratitude, 1 small action. It felt almost comical at first. Then it felt like teamwork. We learned to hold 2 languages together: practical finance and an interior practice without one erasing the other. Agamar dissolved after he had given me the structure. His absence taught me the last lesson: autonomy. The stone in my hand reminded me to be my own mentor when mentors stop arriving. It taught me to scaffold the field with discipline and human work. The ledger closed one way and opened another. We filled the hole in our months not with miracles alone, but with steady habit. The car sat in the garage like a promise kept. The office hummed with a few new projects and the quiet confidence of work done well. Mini cliffhanger. Having learned the code, I now faced a quieter question: if the field continued to answer, what kind of man would I choose to become on the other side? I write this late, with the city a quilt of distant lights below my office window. The glass is cool under my palm. The stone sits on the desk like a small promise. It does not hum, it rests. Sometimes that is the answer: rest. The room smells faintly of paper and lemon cleaner. My chair creaks when I breathe. At 3:33, I still wake sometimes. Not with the old panicked sweat. Just an echo of a rhythm learned in other nights, the beat that once signaled collapse and now calls for attention. I sit up. I place my hand on the stone. The air tastes like expectation. When Agamar left, he left a posture more than instructions. That posture lives in the way my shoulders have uncurled. It lives in the cadence of my sentences. It lives in the small ledger on my kitchen counter where Diana and I list 3 things we did not have a week ago. The ledger is not superstition. It is evidence held like a photograph. I find evidence in the ordinary. A client who pays before the invoice is due. A contractor who arrives on the day they promised. A former student who calls to ask if I will mentor. These events are not fireworks. They are grain slow, steady accumulation. They feel different because I have changed how I meet them. I no longer lean toward each event like a beggar. I meet it as a colleague. When friends ask how it happened, I say the truth. I learned a craft. I learned to arrange my interior so my exterior would stop catching me by surprise. I learned to prepare the senses, name the end, feel the gratitude as if it were memory, and then let go. I practice the loops. I teach them to others at coffee tables and on the phone. I keep the recipe playing. There are 2 short lines I say now when I prepare for anything real. They are mine, shaped by nights of terror and months of steady work. I breathe the end into my bones. I thank the path as if I had walked it already. I hold the want like a visitor welcome, not clinging. I close the door on need. Say them aloud, and the muscles change. The throat relaxes. The breath lengthens. Say them, and the world asks, quietly, if you will walk as if you were chosen. One evening, a young architect sat across from me with a portfolio and a tremble I once recognized as mine. She had 3 months of rent unpaid. She thought the field was a trick. I taught her the pocket script: prepare, name, feel, thank, release. We practiced with a small request, a steady freelance gig for 1 month. She visualized the office light, felt the weight of a contract in her hand, tasted the coffee in the waiting room. 2 days later, she brought me a text that read, "They offered me a 6-week consultation." She cried. I cried. The miracle was gentle. It arrived with an email and an invoice. Another time, an old client, someone who had been terse with me for years, sent a message apologizing for a late payment and included, unexpectedly, praise for a design idea he had shelved. He wrote, simply, "You were right then." The texture of that sentence sounded like repair. Gratitude is not always about receiving money. Sometimes it is the return of dignity. I do not pretend every story is like this. I refuse work whose ethics I cannot own. I still sit in the psychiatrist's office and read the pages the tests provide. I take the medicine when needed. The rituals I learn sit beside prescriptions, not above them. Agamar said this, posture, not replacement. I live by it. I keep my feet on the ground and my hands open. The stone taught me something else. It is an anchor for attention, not a talisman for luck. Once, at a public lecture, a man asked if he could hold the stone. I handed it to him. He turned it over under the auditorium lights, as if searching for a trick. He said nothing. He left with a refund in his mind and a chapter added to his skepticism. The stone stayed on my desk. The lesson was clear. The method works through the body that practices it, not the object that symbolizes it. My days have a scaffolding now. Morning, 2 minutes of sensory naming light, temperature, the feel of my feet on wood. I write one small action on a sticky note. Noon, a 3-breath check to name tension in the neck and release it. Night, 3 details I did not have last week. These are tiny rituals. They are not exotic. They are the work of a life being rewoven. Diana watches me in ways that have softened into something like trust. We fight less about money and more about boundaries. When bills crowd the kitchen table, we do a 2-minute pairing. Breathe. Name one thing we are grateful for. Agree on the next physical step. Once, when a collector called demanding payment we did not yet have, we held the loop. We wrote the name of the invoice at the top of a page, and then we planned the immediate action: email the client, call the contractor, postpone a non-essential purchase. The call ended with a promise to try. 2 weeks later, the client paid. Not a miracle outside effort in answer to steady steps and clear boundaries. At night, I still wake at 3:33, but the sound is not a violent alarm. It is a reminder. I thank the body for remembering. I do a quick check. Lamp, breath, the stone's texture. I name the fear, what if we lose the house, and feel the gravity of it in my chest. I say one of my loops. I breathe the end into my bones. I thank the path as if I had walked it already. Then I let the worry move like a passenger out of the driver's seat. There were times the field seemed to answer in ways that made me dizzy. The magazine cover, the multi-shop contract, keys that felt like permission. I learned to accept the gift without turning it into a claim on self-definition. Possessions did not define me. The posture did. The car I drove from the dealership smelled of new leather. Diana squeezed my hand as I slid the key into my pocket. I felt familiar in my own skin. That feeling was more valuable than the emblem on the hood. The method changes the grammar of choice. I no longer ask to be saved. I ask to be seen as the person who keeps commitments. I propose agreements and then I do the work. Agamar's insistence on responsibility lives in the sentences I say to clients now. I can deliver excellent work on this schedule, not otherwise. Here is what will change if the timeline moves. Those sentences are not brash. They are the scaffolding of trust. People assume the field is a shorthand wish and receive. It is not. It is a discipline that amplifies action. This is one of Agamar's quieter teachings. Influence without hygiene fractures. You can use posture to call things into your life, but if you do not meet them with honest practice, you fracture. I teach with that insistence. At the lecture series the magazine arranged, I spoke of spreadsheets and rituals in the same breath. I gave people scripts for morning practice and for negotiations. I warned them about laziness disguised as miracles. I told them to pay their subcontractors early when possible. That statement earned me a round of applause and the kind of nods that mean the audience recognizes a practical ethic rather than a metaphysical pitch. Autonomy arrived slow and then all at once. Agamar dissolved. The stone did not dissolve. Instead, we paid a subcontractor early instead by leaning on the newly secured small contracts. It did not feel like easy flourishing. It felt like a life being kept whole. Freedom brought new questions. If the field continued to answer, what kind of man would I become? I watched myself for signs of vanity. I declined an interview that wanted a story of mystical transformation without the work. I refused to mythologize the nights. I kept the method plain. I watched how power wanted to make me into something like a prophet. I resisted. Influence without humility is brittle. My language shifted. When Ernesto saw me again, he could not laugh with the same edge. He had seen work, and he respected craft. He still offered a sideways smile. Once he asked me privately if I ever regretted telling the story. Sometimes, I said, but the story is less important than the tools I handed out. If one person stops calling fear an enemy and starts using it as a map, then the regret is small. The stone is a teacher in small ways. I clean it like a tool. I pick it up not to command, but to remember posture. Sometimes the light inside seems deeper. Sometimes nothing happens. Both are fine. The field is not a vending machine. It is a conversation with consequences. I have a practice I offer people who ask for a script. It is short, in the first person, and it is mine. It fits in a pocket and in a breath. Try it and watch what changes in the muscle of attention. Here are 3 variations I use. I prepare the senses. I name the finish. I feel grateful as if it already happened. I let the how be quiet. I draw the want like an arch in my chest. I breathe into the arch. I close the door on need. I say the fact I ask for. I sit with the feeling as if it were memory. I thank the world for remembering me. Say them in a whisper. Say them with your teeth clenched. Say them slowly and watch the body obey. They are not magic words. They are posture. They are rehearsals. At a community meeting, I offered the second loop to a woman who ran a small bakery on the corner. She was exhausted and had been late on rent twice. She tried the arch breath before a meeting with a supplier. She left with a better payment plan and a small order that steadied her week. She texted me. It felt like standing with a friend who knew what to do. That message still sits in my phone. The field also asks for repair. Influence without generosity ripples selfishness. I teach people to use requests as commitments. If you ask the world to answer, be prepared to pay your debts in care. If a client's budget is thin, give them a clear offer. If a subcontractor needs early payment, find a way. The ledger must balance. At nights, I still dream of Agamar's patterns, hexagons of light folding into one another. The shapes now feel like grammar. I have a quieter hunger. I want to teach the posture of steadiness not as spectacle, but as a craft. I want to help others hold business meetings without trembling, to write proposals without begging, to repair family conversations with clear sentences. I also guard against the cult of me. When a stranger asked permission to share my story, I hesitated. The story is useful only as a map. I asked that they present it with work attached, no promises, only tools. They agreed. The message I received was like a small door opening. Someone would adapt the loops for teachers in a low-income neighborhood. I felt a pulse of joy that was less about recognition and more about responsibility. Sometimes the stone glows in a way that feels like a question. Last week it pulsed, and then my phone lit with a message from an editor in another country. They asked if I would write about practice and responsibility as a series for small businesses. The reach felt larger than me. For a moment, I felt old pride stir. I set the pride aside. I remembered the rituals. I returned the editor a plain note. Yes, I will write. And here is the format: practical, short, honest. We agreed on a pilot. A new door. A new task. The teaching that Agamar left me is not a lectern. It is a workbench. It asks for measuring. It asks for revision. It asks for accountability. That is the discipline I carry. There is a small meditation I sometimes lead at the beginning of a workshop. It takes under 2 minutes, and it fits into a pocket of silence. If you are listening now, try it where you are. You can do it in a chair. Close your eyes. Name 3 textures in the room: the cloth of a sleeve, the temperature of the air, the pressure of your feet on the floor. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 2. Breathe out for 6. See, with the eyes of your mind, the thing you want as if it were a memory. Feel the shape, the sound, the smell. Place 1 word on it. Done. Breathe once and say, I walk the steps that follow. Open your eyes. That is the practical lightness, seeing as memory and choosing to walk the steps. I end with a loop I use before important calls. It is short. It fits in the mouth like a coin. I name the end. I feel the end. I move as if it has happened. Say it before a proposal. Say it before a difficult talk. It is not a trick to control outcome. It is a way to steady your voice so the world can respond to the steadiness rather than to your panic. Sometimes, in the quiet between projects, I wonder what else the field will teach me. I wonder who I will be when larger doors open. Will I stay humble? Will I choose repair over show? Will I keep my mornings to 2 minutes? These are the small questions that matter. Tonight the stone glowed faintly, long enough for me to feel a small current under my skin. I smiled and thought of a new class: small groups, workbooks, honest language. The field answers and then asks something back. Will you use what you are given to sustain others? There is no final revelation here. There is a practice that asks to be kept. There are invitations that come as emails and as small groceries paid early. There is a life that refuses to be dramatized. There is the daily act of choosing posture. If you have read this far, thank you. If you are here with your own midnight, know that the moment is an instrument. You can tune it. If you want to try a clean start, come back to the breath. 4 in, 2 hold, 6 out. Name 1 small finish and feel it in your chest. Say, I walk the steps that follow. If this story landed on you in a city I do not yet know, tell me where you are. Which city, which country? Tell me 1 small result you would like in the next month. Write it in the comments or in a message. I read them. I keep a small ledger of where this method goes. If you found value here and you want more plain practice and honest cases, subscribe. It helps the small projects reach more people who may need a practical posture more than a miracle. Thank you for listening. Share where you are, city and country, and 1 small thing you will practice this week. Subscribe, and we will meet again in work, not wonder.